The songs that appear underneath this recording are from the SoundCloud and Bandcamp album called Grey Matter Detective. If you'd like to purchase any of those songs, you can look them up on Bandcamp. Or if you'd like to simply listen to them, you can look them up on Audius or SoundCloud. These songs were made by myself, specifically, so be nice in the comments, I suppose. Or don't. You can also be honest. I appreciate your honesty. At any rate, let's begin the video. Hello. This is Redcode of Vernacular Games. As I am wont to do, I woke up this morning with another thing on my mind, so I'm going to speak on it for a little while. In a previous talk, I mentioned the concept of orange badge and blue badge and red badge. This is a concept that I came across while I was working in Microsoft Alley over in Redmond on the edge of the Bellevue County. Basically, we were on the border between those two counties. But the thing of it is, I had a distinct feeling while I was working in that space as a orange badge contractor that, well, it felt very much like a caste system, and I kind of alluded towards this in the previous talks, but there's a little bit more to that illusion, let's say. Now, as I said before, it's kind of you get certain privileges for being any particular badge, and technically there's a level below orange, which is just no badge. And you could also see that as the untouchables. Now, if you caught what I said before, I said it was a kind of caste system, then you know what I'm referencing, which was a cultural phenomenon in the Indian culture, which is specifically for Hindu culture in particular. They had a caste system where you had the untouchables, the people who did not interact with any part of society. Then you had the people that are slightly level above that, and then you had the people that are slightly level above that, and it went so on and so forth. And the idea was that once you were born, that was where you stayed. And in reality, the concepts that we have here in the West of being able to go up and down in the echelons, regardless of your generation, what generation preceded you, or where you were born. That's actually from from a historical context, it's relatively young. But it's something that specifically the American forefathers kind of encoded with the different constitutions and the different rules, and it was a fairly interesting innovation. But I digress. At least where I was working at Microsoft, I can't speak to the culture in other places, but I did see elements of this also while I was working at Google. It felt like, and forgive the phrasing, it felt like we had reverted to that caste system, and where no badges were the untouchables. The people who couldn't go anywhere, didn't have any permissions, had to do all sorts of crazy things to even get into a building, even though they were supposed to be working there. Even beyond that, even beyond my work at Microsoft specifically, working for the different contracting agencies, specifically VMC, we had the bullpens, as they called them, which is specifically you would be called, firstly, you'd be hired on, and they say, okay, you're on call. And then in the mornings, you would come in to work. And everyone would gather around in the cafeteria or whichever room was most easily accessible from the front door. And a guy would be standing there with a piece of paper in hand, and he'd call out different names. And you would have been told that you were coming in that day. But if your name wasn't on the list, you went back home. You woke up early that morning, possibly did an hour transit to get to work, and then you got no pay. And so you drove back home. This was one of those jobs that you had to actually take unemployment while you were working the job to keep a steady income. And the job itself wasn't exactly that great either. It was really just people putting in the hours to make sure that a game registered as tested. This would be pushing the on and off button on a Xbox over and over again to make sure that the disc doesn't get caught up in the tray. Or booting up a game like 15 times an hour to make sure that, yes, it boots up correctly. These are, very nominal testing tasks that, for all intents and purposes, could be done with AI and automation. Certainly now, they could very well be done that way. But that was the thing. There was an uncertainty to whether or not you were even going to get paid. Now, that was VMC, and I've been on record saying they were the worst contractor that I ever worked with, and I will repeat that as many times as I need to. Hold on. Kitty wants attention. But what I should mention is this is in line with that concept of the caste system where the no badges are the untouchables. So of course they're not allowed to have consistent work or any other thing that is normally afforded to someone. So instead, they're just exploited for their time. But the thing I was mentioning was that the caste system, this is something that kind of comes from the Indian culture. And it just kind of seeped in, I feel like it just kind of seeped into the American tech culture. But I don't think that came from nowhere. Because you see, the tech culture operates off of this idea where there's this liability shield. The liability shield is the contracting agencies. You see, the tech companies themselves don't actually hire the people directly. No, that's only if you're a red badge are you hired directly. This is to avoid certain interesting things on taxes. Essentially, there was a rule put into play a while back that made it so that they can only have a certain amount of employees on staff. And they can only have a certain amount of contractors on staff, and the ratio there is very important, because otherwise they'll get dinged or they'll get sued or for legally liable things. Now, what this resulted in was the people on the bottom rung are, constantly, they're brought in, and then when it looks like a job is done, then they're let go. And because they can only keep a certain amount of people around, it means that there's this constant cycle of bringing people in, letting people go, bringing people in, letting people go. And it's to the point, and they would sometimes well, not sometimes, oft-times lie about how long you were actually going to be on the job. Where they'd say, well, this is a role where you might get hired on and brought in as an employee if you stick around long enough. And we expect this to go for about 9 months, and about 3 months in, you might get laid off. And this comes from, at least in Washington specifically, the fact that the work was at will, which means that for any reason at all, you can be fired. And so while it's kind of presented as a fairly stable work, when you're not looking at the fine print, in reality, it's not stable at all. You get on somebody's nerves, they'll be like, well, you know what? Yeah, it's an at-will state. You're fired. And I know that's very, very petty, and that's not something that most do, but I mean, it's also just comes down to, well, what do the numbers say? Our expenses are really up, and everyone knows that the most expensive thing that you have in your business are the people. So, of course, they're going to cut the people. And so that's a part of that whole phenomenon of being hired on and let go without really much notice. Like, you might not even be given which is standard, mind you might not be given the 2 weeks notice that you're supposed to be given whenever your job is about to end. It might be, well, no, today you're on, tomorrow you're gone. And we've seen that across the gaming industry as well, particularly, I think, in Riot and a few others. But I digress. What I was pointing at was the fact that you have the contracting agencies that act as a liability shield. And the thing is, with all of those other rules in place, the people who are involved will be understandably angry, and they will, cop a lawsuit at some point. But since you are hired under the contractor and not employed by the company writ large, the contractor is the one that takes the brunt of the lawsuit. That's their role. Now, they'll present themselves as a agency that's looking for talent, looking for people to bring into the jobs. But as one of my roommates once said, they're actually a bucket brigade. They know people are looking for these jobs, and all they need to do is put out a feeler, grab a person. They don't necessarily need to evaluate them, and say, this job will pay this much, and you will have consistent work. And the person will say, yes, boss, just give me the job. I need the money. Now, to be fair to the contracting agencies, I worked under a number of them, and they gave me a number of opportunities. And particularly, I would say, Collabora and Brilio treated me well for the time that I was working with them. I actually managed to land a couple contracts that I was able to stick around for, and one that I actually was able to leave of my own volition rather than be laid off from. That was a rarity, I will say. But even they are not immune to the thing that I was alluding to with regards to the caste system. Or rather, they are not, how would I say, unimplicated. Because as I mentioned, the caste system, that's a Eastern thing that's from Hindu culture, Indian culture. And this might sound a little bit off, but any of you who've ever gotten onto a call and been routed to a call center should understand that, at least in the tech space, it's largely influenced by Indian culture. And while I can't make a one-to-one connection, it still feels like you're in a caste system where you're out there while you're working in the tech space. Certainly, the orange badges, we all recognized that, well, how would I say? I remember it was one time we were at Google. They sent out an invitation to a party, and it went out across the entirety of the company. And then, about 2 days later, I think it was a day before the actual party itself, another email comes, and it says, "Oh, we're sorry, you weren't supposed to get that email." And by you, that meant the entire floor of mappers for Google Maps. The people who were parsing all of the data that was coming in from across the world and making sure that it was real. "You aren't invited to the party. We're sorry for the inconvenience of getting your hopes up that you could go out and have chicken with the rest of the people. Be a real boy. No, you're not invited. We're sorry." And this was not an uncommon thing, although it was never this direct. It was always just, "Well, yeah, no, they're having a party over there. So how are we going to get in?" "What do you mean?" "Well, that's for the blue badges, right?" Because that's the other thing, for instance, on the Microsoft campus, the cafeteria, they have badge trackers there. Now, this is for security, of course, but if you're an orange badge, you're, you're part of the group, so you should be allowed in, right? But no. If you wanted to actually go to the cafeteria and eat food or participate in one of the company-wide events, you needed to get a manager with you who was willing to spend the time, because it wouldn't be an official thing to let you in. And so that was a part of that whole bit, but I digress. A lot of the contracting agencies that I worked for were bankrolled or headed by people of Indian descent. And this isn't to say that Indian people are bad or anything like that, but this is more just understanding the concept of cultural drift, where if you allow cultural stuff to come into your space, you will see it shift. You need to pay attention to that. Now, I will posit that the very concept, I don't think anyone was actively trying to build a caste system. Rather, it just kind of naturally fell into place, and the people in charge just kind of accepted that, oh, well, this is familiar. I guess this is how things work. That's if I'm being charitable. The other angle to look at it would be that it's not even necessarily that, again, that it was a maliciously implemented thing from the angle of wanting a caste system to exist within the Microsoft campus or any other tech company, but rather that the bottom line stated that this is how things should work. And once they found an answer, they're like, okay, we're good. We're going to put our brain power to something else. As I mentioned, the whole liability shield thing, and the other part of it is, call centers, probably based out of Hyderabad, if I had to guess. Most of them are. The thing of it is that comes back to the bottom line of where are you going to get the cheapest labor? It's not here in the United States. It's going to be outside of this country. And that's where you're going to get the cheapest contractors for sure. But even beyond that, there's another thing with regards to the American culture and the Indian culture. And frankly, the Indian culture is a lot more hardworking. And I don't mean to denigrate my own culture, but there's definitely more of a sense of entitlement here in the Americas. Now, I think some of that is warranted because, we have God-given rights. There are things that we should have. But I think on a certain level, America has become a nation of princes, as I put it, where, the generations before us did a lot of things and we were supposed to inherit that. But we're still in that position of not having all of the skills, not having all of the responsibilities, and not necessarily leaning into those responsibilities either. Oddly enough, the example that comes to mind is there was a game called Triangle Strategy, which I know is a terrible name, made by Square Enix. And in that game, you played the heir to an estate that had a history of mercenary work, working specifically for the king, but they could do work for other groups as well. And so it was your job to manage the place as your father weakened over the years and would eventually die. But what's interesting is that you had three factions. You had the faction that was kind of Russian America, which is very interesting, as it had a very capitalistic approach, but it was also in a Serbian-like locale, and so also had this very rough and tumble, you must survive, only the strong survive kind of thing going on. And then you had another group that was very, I can't really say it any other way, it was kind of Islamic in nature, where it was very religiously oriented. Oh, that's true. The other thing that was kind of anachronistic, I would say, with the Serbian-esque group was that they were secular, which, as you know, the Russia and the rest are actually Orthodox in nature. But anyway, the other group was kind of Islamic in nature, so it was very much religion ruled the day. They did everything. That was kind of what motivated them, what shifted things around, and it was that, but it also combined a little elements of Hinduism as well, where they actually did have a caste system there as well. They actually had a untouchable class that you could interact with. It's a fascinating game, actually. Very fascinating. It might have had some interesting conclusions it came to, but I digress. Your group, the kingship that you could interact with, which was the group that you were connected to at the beginning, they had a prince who was he was ill-suited to the role, and whenever it came time for him to make a decision, he didn't really put the nation first, or rather, he didn't even have the wherewithal to really think in the way of, well, wait, what is the best political decision here? And when his father dies, which it's a political execution, and there's all sorts of things going on there, he inherits the kingdom, but ends up having to run away in exile. And all throughout the game, he's making different decisions that kind of push him away from that responsibility. And one of his final decisions, because there's a big plot point where you have to choose which faction you're going to ally yourself with, or rather not faction, but which line of thinking. And it's a slightly different thing. But the prince's decision was to give up all of that responsibility and hand it off to specifically the Eastern group in this case. Although I think there is a scenario where he might actually give it up to another group, but there were some other parts. There are some other parts that I don't want to spoil. But he makes that decision, and he just kind of gives up the responsibility to someone else. And I do feel like that's something that happened here in the Americas, is we kind of gave up. Here I go again with despising a birthright. We kind of gave that up, in a sense. Certainly with selling out all of our resource making methodologies to other countries. Certainly with not paying any of our people a living wage. Well, trying not to anyway. But I digress. I'm kind of jawing on and on here, but one of the things I wanted to highlight was just when I saw what I saw while I was working in the tech industry was a caste system. And it wasn't, how would I say, absolute. There were ways to move up, but it was, you had to kind of be a charismatic trickster to do it, in some regards. You just had to make people like you. It wasn't really a matter of doing your best work. Like, doing your best work would get you only so far. And I would say that that's a general thing in American culture, is there's doing your best work, and then there's selling yourself. And you won't get the opportunity to do your best work if you don't sell yourself well here. And that's a thing. That's definitely a thing. You have to have good flim-flam, as I say. Now, there are exceptions, of course. But those exceptions are things that you have to really search for and find. Like, I would think, too, in the blue-collar space, I got started as an electrician after spending 2 years looking for my way in, because the unions wouldn't let me get started. They wouldn't let me actually start the work that would get me the experience to get me into the unions. Rather, they kept expecting me to already be the guy. It wouldn't be until I landed in Florida, and which had a lot, and at the moment still has a lot of construction going on, and they just needed workers, that I would just knock on a door and be let in and start working. And just spit spot like that. Even quicker than getting started as a retail store person, which there I had to actually go through corporate and get my application looked at and all of that stuff. No, it was just knock on the door, you're in. Which has its own things, and I might talk about that at another time. But that's all I really had to say at the moment. For your consideration, if you intend to start a business and that sort of thing, I would ask that you pay attention to how your hierarchies are approached, and make sure that it's understood that there is a merit-based thing going on, or at least that you know that the people that are moving up have some sort of skill involved in that, but also that there is actually an ability to move up, and that you're not presenting, how would I put it, that you're not presenting them with a bum ticket, and that you're not giving them what looks like an opportunity, but is actually, well, then again, I'm talking about blessings and curses. You present them an opportunity that looks like a blessing, but is actually a curse in disguise. That's all I have to say for the moment. So, this is Redcoat of Vernacular Games. We're still working on a number of projects right now. Particularly, we have Record Biz, which is a board game about doing business in the recording industry. And that one is still underway. The waiting list is attached below this video. And I'll also be putting out the waiting list periodically on all of our different social channels. We're on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the rest. Additionally, we're working on doing a remake of our first game, Highway to the Moon. If all goes well, I think we'll actually be starting live development next month. So that's exciting. But if you want to get a taste of what the first game was like, you can check it out on Steam. That's Highway to the Moon on Steam. It goes for 99 cents, so it won't hurt your wallet. Additionally, you can pay what you want for it on itch.io if you feel like donating towards the cause. Additionally, we have Legends of Mathmatica Squared that is also available on Steam. A little classical RPG with a few twists here and there. Following along with that, there is The Fairy and the Dragon, a book we did for one Jeffrey Morgan, a member of Whimsitale and Inertia Productions. And that is available on BookBaby. It's also available on the other storefronts, but BookBaby is where you're going to find it most easily. And if you just feel like supporting us directly, for now, we have a Buy Me a Ko-fi, or that's one of those Patreon-style sites. You can donate there and pay what you feel is good to keep us going. Every little bit counts. Every little bit helps. So, without further ado, I'll bring this to the sign-off. This is Redcoat, signing off. Play the games you want to play, boyos.